If Barbarossa missed Moscow by only weeks, did one late start decide the whole campaign? It sounds plausible. It is also the trap. This is the story of how Germany got frighteningly close to Moscow in 1941, and why that still was not enough. The short answer is not winter alone, or one delay alone. It was a campaign built on one giant assumption, that the Soviet Union would collapse fast enough to make every other problem irrelevant. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. German planning had aimed for a rapid campaign, and Directive Number 21 set a May 15th readiness date. So the question comes naturally. If the invasion had started earlier, would Moscow have fallen? Maybe, but only if we ignore the deeper structure of the campaign. At first, the invasion looked devastating. German army groups smashed across a huge front. Soviet formations were encircled in enormous numbers. On the map, the advance looked unstoppable. But the map hid the real story. Every mile east was a success. Every mile east also stretched fuel, ammunition, repairs, food, and transport thinner. Barbarossa did not just need momentum. It needed the war finished before distance and attrition took control. That was not a side problem. It was built into the plan. German leaders expected the Red Army to be shattered near the frontier and the Soviet state to crack under the shock. That expectation shaped the timetable, the supply system, and the broader vision behind the war. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It was badly damaged, disorganized, and suffering enormous losses. Yet it was still alive. And that changed what time meant. The reasons for the June 22nd start are still debated in emphasis. Historians usually point to a mix of factors, including the Balkan campaign, redeployments, and difficult spring ground conditions. So yes, lost weeks may have mattered, but what matters more is what those weeks ran into. A front pushing farther from its railheads. Soviet railways that had to be converted for German use. Poor roads. Vehicles breaking down. Horses dying. Supplies arriving late, or not in the quantities needed to sustain the pace of advance. That is the hinge of the story. Barbarossa was not just racing the calendar, it was racing the failure of its own assumptions. By late summer and early autumn, Germany had won huge battles but still had not secured the decision it wanted. Soviet resistance was battered and chaotic. It was also continuous. New formations kept appearing. Industry was being evacuated east. The Soviet state was bending without breaking, and every German advance came with a price. Men, machines, fuel, tires, horses, time. Then came the season people remember most. The autumn mud, the Rasputitsa, is often treated like the dramatic twist that stopped everything. In reality, it magnified problems already there. Roads turned to sludge, trucks bogged down, artillery slowed. Supply columns crawled. So yes, mud mattered, but mud hurt so much because the system behind the advance was already strained. Then came the drive on Moscow. This is the close call at the center of the story. In the final push of 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital. Not the city center. Not a clean breakthrough. But close enough that the timing question becomes irresistible. If the invasion had begun sooner, if the roads had held longer, if logistics had bent a little less, could Moscow have fallen? Some historians do argue that an earlier start might have improved Germany's chances around Moscow. That is a reasonable counterfactual. A few extra weeks in better conditions could have mattered at the margin. But margin is the key word. Even with an earlier opening, the Germans would still have faced the same geography, the same supply fragility, the same wear on men and machines, and the same Soviet capacity, however battered, to recover and resist. And even the Moscow question can mislead. Barbarossa did not fail only because one objective remained just out of reach. It failed because it depended on early victories ending the war before the campaign's internal weaknesses became fatal. That never happened. By early December, German troops near Moscow were exhausted, exposed, undersupplied, and facing severe winter conditions for which preparation had been inadequate. On December 6, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. fresh Soviet forces struck an enemy that had advanced to the edge of what its system could sustain. So why did Moscow stay out of reach? Not because of one delay alone, not because of winter alone, and not because Germany was not dangerous. It was extremely dangerous. For months, the outcome was not obvious. But the drive on Moscow failed because the operation rested on a false expectation that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly enough to spare Germany from the consequences of distance, weak logistics, prolonged resistance, seasonal conditions, and cumulative exhaustion. That is the harder lesson. In 1941, failure was not inevitable. Moscow was not saved by one neat turning point. It was saved by surviving long enough for the invaders' timetable to break.